Hello, I'm Jana, and welcome back to the Crafty Corner. Today, we're going to be taking a look at substrates. There are quite a few substrates in the distress world, and they all do something a bit different, and they each have a wonderful purpose in the craft world. So, if you'd like to see exactly which supplies we're going to be using here today, go ahead and pause here. All right, let's head over to the Crafty Corner. Today we are deep diving into substrates, and there are a lot of them. So I thought the best way to get into substrates would be to compare different substrates and coloring with distress products. So to start with, we have got some mixed media paper. It's kind of a lovely cream and plays pretty nicely with all of the products. Then we've got the Distress watercolor paper. Absolutely love this. This is some of my favorite for flowy techniques. Next, we've got the Distress white heavy stock. Very heavy and very durable. Then we've got some of the Distress kraft stock. It's a darker color, so it can make certain things pop. Then we've got the Distress black heavy stock. This one is a little bit more limited because some things aren't going to show up on it as nicely as others. For example, Distress inks are not going to show on this because they are dye-based. However, Distress oxides on this do pop. Then we get into two of the lesser known, not as frequently used substrates. We've got specialty stamping paper. This can be really cool for lots of different techniques, and it can give a super crisp image when stamping. And we'll get a chance to play with that and see exactly what it does. And then we have glossy cardstock. Again, this is great for very specific techniques, and it can also give some pretty nice stamped images. But it does have a few limitations, but we will explore these as we try out different distress mediums across each of these. So, to start, we are going to be stamping onto each of these substrates. I already have a stamping block pre-prepared with 7 different stamps on it. Now, the reason we have 7 different stamps is because each stamp is going to be used for a specific distress product. We're going to be using some distress inks, distress oxide re-inker, distress crayons, distress watercolor pencils, distress paint, distress re-inker. I even got my hands on some of the old distress markers. And we're going to see how each of these products plays across all of the substrates. So first things first, we need to stamp down our images so we can start seeing how these work together. Okay, so I've got everything set up on the Tim Holtz Tonic stamping platform. And we're going to stamp like this. That way, in case something doesn't stamp quite perfectly on round 1, it will be very easy to line up and stamp again. So just off to the side, I'm quickly adding my Distress Archival Black Soot ink to the stamps, making sure that I've got good coverage. Just giving a little push and twist. And we're going to stamp this down, see what we get. We might need to restamp, but since we're on the platform, it won't be a big deal at all. So just good firm pressure all around, making sure that we're getting everything stamped. Okay, let's see what we got. Yep, and I do need to add a bit more ink and stamp again, but that works out quite well. So I'm just going to add some more ink. Let's see which places needed a bit more. The top of the mushrooms. There we go. The other butterfly stamped really well. That's cool. All right. And stamp again. Let's check that. There we go. Now we have a nice clean stamped image. So I'm going to stamp out the rest of these substrates and then we'll dive right into the coloring. So let's just move that off. All right, I'm lined up at 2 inches. Let's go ahead and put the rest of this on fast forward as I finish stamping out our substrates. I do have one more set of substrates that I do want to compare since I have all of these wonderful distress products out. These are the top 3 products that I do not recommend using as substrates. If they're all you've got, they can be used, but it will take some finessing to use them. But I can guarantee it will be pretty darn frustrating. So what we have here is printer paper, index weight cardstock, and manila folder. So in and of themselves, these have purposes, and they are definitely good for things in the crafting world, but they do not really play nicely with distress products because distress was, well, designed to work with distress products. So just for the sake of argument, let's go ahead and stamp these as well, and I imagine just even stamping with archival will be pretty telling to the nature of these substrates. So I'm just going to go ahead and ink up on the side. We are doing this in real time because I suspect that even the archival ink is going to have some potential issues. Okay, so we've got our ink, we're stamping that down. Now, number 1, on the printer paper, it is thin, and, well, it's pretty absorbent. So we do have some stamped images here. Let's go ahead, I'll just try to clean these up a little bit more. The paper in general, it's like really super absorbent, and I don't know, it's not going to hold water very well, and we're not going to get any of those lovely wicking qualities. Okay. See, it doesn't even really want to absorb the ink. Let's try to get that butterfly tip. Okay. All right, so this is the printer paper. And as you can see, it's already trying to bleed through. It's super thin, and it's not meant to absorb anything other than, well, printer ink. So you can see that we've got some ghosting coming through. That's not so great, but let's go ahead and set this aside. Next, let's pull in the index weight cardstock. This won't be as bad for bleed, but it's not going to want to give up ink and allow it to spread out nicely. Okay, so consider this kind of a what not to do with distress, and just let me save you the pain of trying this and being exceedingly disappointed. Because we can tell you all you want, don't use these things, but if you don't see the evidence, well, then I guess it could be hard to believe that, oh, this stuff really doesn't work because it wasn't really designed to, but that's okay. This is part of the what if, and it's a learning step. Okay, so here we go with the index weight cardstock. It's not terrible. It's not bleeding, which makes me exceedingly happy. But when we start putting water on here, it's not going to be so great. But the imaging, it's not horrible. All right, now on to the manila. Just put that right here. Move our magnets back in. I love the magnets because they keep everything in place and keep things from slippy sliding. Also, I have some of the grip mat underneath, which I absolutely love for keeping things in place. So I've got a piece permanently living in the tonic stamping platform. Okay, this shouldn't be too bad for stamping. It's not thin like the printer paper, and it's about the same weight, maybe a little thicker than the index cardstock, but it won't be terrible. I can safely say that early on, I did chop up a ton of manila folders and use them when I was first learning. It can do some of the stuff that distress does, but it's really not your best option. But it's also not the worst option. If you were absolutely on a budget and just couldn't justify the distress watercolor cardstock, this would be my only recommendation to go to. Stamping comes out pretty good. It's definitely got a yellow hue to it, so it's going to affect the way the pigments look on here, but it is going to be the closest thing that we're going to get to mixed media cardstock, and it will play relatively nicely with water, which you will see momentarily. But either way, stamping, not as terrible. And let's just take a closer look at these three. Let's not go there substrates. We've got our printer paper in the middle that has bled through. We've got our index weight kraft stock, thicker but won't play with water as nicely. And then we've got the manila folder chunk. Honestly, if I was going to lay odds on which one of these is going to work the best, I would say it's going to be with the manila folder. But enough talk. Let's find out how these play with distressed products. We have everything stamped. It is time to start the color comparison. We're going to be starting off with the mixed media cardstock first, and we're going to be starting with the distress inks. Now for the distress inks, I'm just using a water brush to add the color to this fedora. So as you can see, it's going down pretty nicely, and it works very well on mixed media. Mixed media and distress definitely play very well together. So just spread that around, get the color where we want it. There, nice and smooth. All right, so for the hat, we're just using some black soot and a dash of Mermaid Lagoon. So as you can see, very easy coloring, no fuss with this one. It's a good, smooth transfer. So the plan is to do each stamped image with a different medium. We will compare how all of the different mediums worked on a substrate before we jump into the next substrate. Now in the meantime, let's go ahead and put the rest of this coloring on fast forward. Okay, here is our first card with all of the different distress mediums on here. So here we have the re-inkers. As you can see, that went down really nicely. Over here, we have got the distress crayons. It's a little bit more cloudy, but it still goes down really smooth. Here we have the distress oxide. You can see the oxidation going on here. It's really pretty, really vibrant. That was the oxide re-inker. This butterfly, we've got the distress paint. Over here, we've got the distress watercolor pencil. That blended down really nicely. I love how that moves on the mixed media. Then over here, we have the re-inkers. Now, the re-inkers are interesting. While it looks pretty good on here, my one objection is that it soaks into the mixed media very, very quickly. So it's hard to get a good blend, and there's just a little bit of bleed, but that's probably due to the amount of condensed pigment in there. So it's not bad, but it's just what I'm noticing. And over here, we've got the distress markers. As you can tell, that went down nice and smooth. Okay, next we're going to be moving on to the distress watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to be keeping my swatches the same. So each time, this hat is going to be the distress inks, then we'd have the distress crayon, the oxide re-inker, the paint, the watercolor pencil, the markers, and the distress re-inkers. So I'm going to try to keep that consistent so that we can see how this plays out all across the substrates. Okay, let's go ahead and put this back on fast forward and work on our next substrate. are the results on the Distress watercolor cardstock. Honestly, I love everything on here. Distress watercolor cardstock is probably the most versatile of all the Distress substrates. It plays nicely with everything, and that is why it is my absolute go-to for whenever I'm creating, whether I'm painting, marbling, spraying, spritzing, or coloring. This substrate handles everything gorgeously. So take a look at the vibrant colors. Oh, so good. And the re-inkers, look at the vibrancy of that. I love it. It's so, so good. So now we're going to move on to our next substrate, and that would be the Distress White Heavy Stock. As you can see, the stamping on this is nice and crisp. And we'll see how it stands up as we lay down the other mediums on top of it. It is a absolutely brilliant white, so I am very interested in seeing how this compares to the Distress watercolor cardstock. Let's go ahead and put things on fast forward. Okay, let's take a look at how the Distress White Heavy Stock did. Now, this paper is interesting. It stamps beautifully, but it does not like to play nice with water mediums. As you can tell, it's a lot more streaky, and there's this really odd texture going on. I don't know if the camera's picking it up, but the paper now has these little random divots in it. So I do not particularly like using this for wet mediums. Now, the interesting thing is it plays relatively nicely with the Distress paint. If I'm going to be doing a stamped and layered technique using Distress paints, then this paper works pretty well. It's not terrible with the Distress watercolor pencils either, but you're not going to get that same fluid spread as you would on the watercolor cardstock. Now, the Distress markers, if you're using the markers just as markers, it's fine and it's perfectly good to color on. But if you try to activate the water feature of the markers, it's not going to play nice. What I noticed when I was putting down the different pigments is this paper absorbs everything really, really fast. And as you can see, we're getting a little bit of a lasagna thing going on here with the paper starting to buckle just a bit. And again, the re-inkers, they absorb so fast. I had zero time to attempt to even blend these out. I had to water down my solution on the glass media mat in order to get some different shades of brown going on here. And the paper is still, it's got this really weird texture. But I do know that these make great card bases and are wonderful to collage on. Now, I like this even more. If we did a collage and then I spread it with collage medium, then over the top, I would absolutely be using Distress crayon to smudge and smear to get all sorts of really cool effects. So this is a great substrate. It just depends on what you're trying to do with it. All right, moving right along. Next one, we've got kraft stock. Now, I've already got a hunch about this one. This is pretty porous, and I don't think we're going to be getting much of a blend on here. I suspect the Distress paints and the crayon are going to be the two that perform the best on it. Well, actually, no. The oxide should do pretty well too, as long as we're not expecting a really good blend. But stamping with oxide on here is pretty awesome. All right, let's go ahead and color in our images. Here are results for kraft stock. This is interesting. This actually went a lot better than I expected it to, and the results, I'm liking that. Now, here's the weird thing. The one thing that didn't quite work the way I expected it to was the distress paint. That almost completely got rid of my image and obscured it. Whereas on the others, I was able to dilute the paint down enough so that I could still see the details of the butterfly. That's weird. But at the same time, I got this really cool marbling thing going on. So it works. Honestly, kraft stock, I could safely say that you can really use anything you want on it. The oxide does this really cool thing on here. We got some great colors going on. We can really see the oxidation, and I absolutely love that. Oxide on kraft is one of my favorites. Now, crayon on kraft, that worked great. I actually was able to get a blend on here. I was shocked. Typically, I haven't been able to do that in the past, but it worked. And the same with the distress ink. It came out really nice, and the paper's not buckling, so that's even better. The re-inkers worked very well too. But one thing I'm noticing is that the water is sitting more on the surface of this. I expected it to really sink in a lot faster, and yet I've still got a few puddles of water going on here. That's not what I expected. The distress pencils, they show up beautifully on here. I'd absolutely use distress pencils on this. And the lighter colors really, really pop, which I'm loving. The markers, it's not great. It's not bad. It is totally doable. So, more possibilities to create when using kraft stock. So, the next substrate that we're going to be pulling in is the specialty stamping paper. Now, specialty stamping paper is pretty darn special because look at the detail of the stamps. The detail is just absolutely amazing. And this is what this paper is meant for. It is meant to be stamped on and altered. Not to mention there's other really cool techniques that can be used with this paper as well, but the detail on it, it gets me every time. It's very different, and it's pretty significant, like in comparison to the distress heavy stock. Let's see, these two butterflies. You can tell just looking at them how much more detail there is on the one on specialty stamping versus the heavy white stock. So if you want detail in your stamps, I highly recommend going for the specialty stamping paper. Absolutely 100% worth it. Okay, let's go ahead and color these images. Take a closer look. This is the specialty stamping paper, and as you can see, the detail is pretty vibrant. It did not take a lot of distress ink to get color onto the hat, just like a little dip with the brush, and we got some really vibrant color going on here. Now, specialty stamping paper really grips onto color, and this is neat. The oxide, it's definitely more chalky on here. That's interesting. But the re-inkers, the paper just absorbed it, and just look at the vibrancy. I absolutely love that. It is really interesting just how this reacted so differently from some of the other papers. This is going to look so cool in the side-by-side comparison. All right, so we're going to set this one aside, and next we're going to be pulling in the Glossy cardstock. This is super, super shiny, and it's going to behave very similarly to the specialty stamping paper. It's going to be very absorbent, and we're going to get definitely a vibrancy of colors. But I think the wild card is going to be the oxide. I think this might look a bit different from what we've seen before. Okay, so this is our second to last traditional distress substrate, so let's go ahead and put things on fast forward. glossy cardstock. Now, this is already pretty interesting. The oxide did not want to dry very nicely on this, and if we run our finger across it, we get a bit of lifting, which is very interesting. That chalky powder wants to come off. Now, the distress paint was not very good. It does not like the shininess of the glossy cardstock. It wanted to pool and puddle, and it did not give us very smooth coverage. It works, but if we were going to be doing distress paint on glossy cardstock, then we might want to be looking at a marbling technique instead of trying to paint in detail. Now, with the distress ink and the distress crayon, I noticed a lot of bleed through. The cardstock is very glossy and it repels the water and makes these interesting little puddles around here, and you can see where the inks are trying to blend into each other, and here it's definitely a bit more streaky with the crayon. So this paper definitely wants to hang on to the color, but it doesn't want to let the color settle. It wants the color to move. So again, if I was going to be using glossy cardstock, I'd be leaning towards a technique instead of trying to paint. Now, the one that I thought came out the nicest was the Distress Re-Inker. That absorbed right into the paper, and we've got some very nicely colored mushrooms. Also, the Distress Marker, that was absorbed very quickly as well, but you can definitely see a bit of streakiness where I colored things in. So all in all, it's not bad, but it's very interesting with the way it reacts with the different mediums. Okay, so next we have the Distress Block Heavy Stock. Now, this will work only with some of our mediums. We're not even going to attempt the Distress Inks or the Distress Crayons. Well, let me show you what I mean. The Distress Inks are a dye-based dye, so when we go to add the color, nothing happens because this is transparent. The same with the crayon. If we did a mica crayon, we would get something, but with the regular crayon, it's not going to give us anything. Now, just for the sake of comparison, I'm going to put down a small splotch of mica crayon just to show you what I mean. The mica crayon will show up because it's got the shiny metallic in it, but the other one, just used on its own, painted on, it's not going to show up. And if we put it directly on here, it pretty much blends right into the cardstock as well. So we'll skip over those two and jump straight into the Distress Oxide. Now, I think we'll do this in real time just because some of these things just aren't going to show up very well, so this is going to go quicker. So the Distress Oxide, that paints on very nicely, but we are going to lose the detail of that stamped butterfly because the picket fence is not an archival ink, and it is simply going to blend out as I add the oxide. But in and of itself, the oxide is really pretty on the Distress Heavy Black cardstock. All right, going in with a little bit of the oxide. The colors are really, really pretty, and I do like that on here. So we do know that the black heavy stock will play nice with the oxides, and we can definitely paint and get some really interesting things going on. Now, the distress paint is also going to pretty much react the same way. We'll just go in with some of that yellow. It's going to cover up the picket fence that we stamped down, but the paint, since it is opaque, will show up and give us some lovely color. All right, next color. Yep, it shows up beautifully, but sadly hides our detail. If I wanted to actually stamp and add some color, I'd probably stamp with the picket fence just to get the idea of where I want to put color down, but I'd keep this in the stamping platform and double stamp over the top with an archival ink to bring back that detail. So as you can see, great color, but we lose the detail. All right, moving on to the coffee cup. I don't think we're going to get much with the distress colored pencils, but ooh, hang on. That's interesting. So when I color this on here, that does work. That's interesting. The paper is very toothy and it is gripping the pencil down very nicely. I'm actually really surprised. But again, I feel that we're going to be losing some of that stamped image just because it's picket fence. That's interesting. You can see the lines through the colored pencil. If I add water to this, I will lose the picket fence. So if I just color this in and don't watercolor, we actually get a pretty neat effect. I like that. Huh. Not what I was expecting, but it works. Okay. So yes, we can use the distressed watercolor pencil on here. Interesting. Now, the reinkers, it's already a lost cause because, again, it's translucent. It's a dye, not a pigment. So as soon as I put that on there, it's gone. It's not going to show up. So reinkers, no. And the same with the distress markers. These, again, not pigment-based, dye-based. So it's not going to show up. So with the black heavy stock, we've really got 3 options. Technically 4 if we include the distress mica crayons. We can do paint, we can do oxides, and we can do colored pencils, and technically we can do the mica crayons. All right, so that takes care of the black heavy stock. Now, on to our last examples. These are the 3 substrates that I do not recommend using with distress products. We have got printer paper, index weight cardstock, and manila. I'm going to put all 3 of these on fast forward, and we'll come back and take a look at the results after I've filled all of these in. And I think just from the fast forwarded video, you're going to see why these substrates are very problematic. All right, let's see what happens. Here are the 3 other substrates. We have the manila folder, the index weight cardstock, and the printer paper. So let's take a look at the printer paper first. First of all, look at the paper. It is getting pretty warped, and as you can see, most of these things bleed through. The paper is very, very absorbent, and it does not give me a lot of time to play or to do any shading with the colors. Now, interestingly, the oxide worked the best on this paper. The marker is pretty streaky, the colored pencil faded out, and I wasn't able to blend it when I was taking a water brush to it. The paint got pretty gloppy in places and it didn't want to spread. So that's interesting. The oxide actually played the best on the printer paper. All right, moving on to the cardstock. Now, the cardstock, again, it's not very thick, so we got some bleed through on this. It's not great, but it is better than the copy paper. Now, the paint played relatively nice on here. It's not terrible. It didn't turn gloppy, and you can still see the detail. The ink and the crayon, it's very streaky. There's just not enough time to blend things out. Again, it's super absorbent, so it's hard to get color down smoothly. The colored pencil actually played really nicely on this, and I'd say the colored pencil worked, out of all the materials we used, it worked the best on the index weight cardstock. So that's interesting. Now, moving on to the manila. The manila had the best results of all 3 substrates. It doesn't absorb the mediums as fast, but it doesn't quite do what the other things do, that like with the distress substrates. The blending is slightly better. You actually have a little bit of time to blend things out, but the color of this, it really drastically changes the color on here, and that to me makes this not an overly friendly substrate. It's doable in a pinch. You could practice some of the techniques on here, but your color trade-off, I'm not sure if it's worth it. So it's interesting all the same comparing these 3 questionable substrates. Today we have played with a whole variety of substrates. We have mixed media cardstock, distress water cardstock, distress heavy white cardstock, kraft stock, specialty stamping paper, glossy cardstock, and black heavy cardstock. Now, this has been very interesting. We've got a great comparison of all these different distress mediums over the top of these different substrates. Stay tuned for part 2 when we create a collage showcasing all of these different elements in a convenient and decorative table layout. Thank you so much for joining me here today at the Crafty Corner as we played with substrates. Until next time, happy crafting.